anyway. We are here to sort of talk about a remarkable book Dr. Sam Klug has presented to us. But first, let's acknowledge why we decided to do this event this month. This month is Black History Month, both here at GW, here in America, and around the world that the diaspora touches. This is a celebration, not just this month as the shortest month, but all year round, where we choose for specific reasons to use this month as a commemoration of all of the African Americans, Black Americans, use your vernacular, that have helped us throughout the way and have been a solid part of American history. My name is Dwayne Kwaysee Wright. I'm an assistant professor of higher education administration, and I also have the pleasure and privilege of serving as director of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives here at the Graduate School for Education and Human Development. And on behalf of our Dean, Michael Foyer, our faculty, our staff, and of course, most importantly, our students, we'd like to welcome you to this book talk. Today, we are thrilled to be in partnership with the Elliott School for International Affairs, principally their Assistant Dean for Student Services and DEI, Lakeisha Harrison, and the program manager over there, Lou McCaffrey. This program would not be possible without them. We are also joined by their LEAP initiative, and I want to give a big shout out to Sebastian Reyes, who has been a wonderful help with bringing this program together. And just so you can appreciate our co-sponsors, I'm going to put a few links in the chat so you can see the good work that they are doing. And so, with that said, Dr. Klug's book is called The Internal Colony, Race and the American Politics of Global Decolonization. I will introduce Dr. Klug in 1 minute, but first, this is a book talk, so you might want to, at some point, buy the book. I'll put both the Chicago Press link in there, and I will put the Amazon link in there. This is not to further advertise Amazon or big tech at all, but I know it's probably easier for some of you to do so. But I will encourage you to pick up the book at your local bookstore if you can, as we're trying to keep that alive. And for those that my students are here for extra credit, might not have the time to read a whole book, there is an excerpt from the book in the Boston Review. It's called The Lexicon of Empire. And I guarantee if you get to read that Boston Review article, you'll want to pick up the entire book because it really is a remarkable piece of historical analysis. And now to the star of the show, Dr. Sam Klug. Dr. Sam Klug is an assistant teaching professor in U.S. history. He received his Ph.D. in history from Harvard University in 2020. What a year to do that. He is currently not working on his first book, but currently has produced his first book, The Internal Colony, Race and the American Politics of Decolonization, which started out as a dissertation. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. His work has been supported by the American Council on Learned Societies, the LBJ Presidential Library, and the Rockefeller Archive Center, as well as the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, where I believe he was a fellow before going to Loyola. His writing has appeared in the Diplomatic History, the Journal of History of International Law, Political Magazine, the Boston Review, and Dissent. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sam Klug. Sam, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Dr. Wright. And it's great to have everyone here. I appreciate you all making it out on Zoom for this book talk.
Yes, yes. We appreciate our audience bearing down the snow and joining us. So, we want to talk about the book. I've put the links in the chat. But before we get there, I always am very interested in the scholar behind the scholarship. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Sam Klug? What does that very short introduction leave out? I'm sure it leaves out a lot. And, what do we need to know about you in relation to this book?
Great. Wonderful. Yes. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about kind of how I came to the project maybe, and that'll help to identify some of these things. I'm originally from the Boston area, big Boston Celtics fan, so shout out to them. I see the eye roll. No, but I came to this project while at kind of in the early phases of graduate school in history. And I was very interested in the history of Black social and political thought and where that fits in the kind of broader field of U.S. intellectual history. And I was also very interested in questions about empire and decolonization and sort of how ideas about empire and decolonization were reflected and have been reflected in the American mind, I suppose. And I started to kind of think more seriously about what my dissertation project would be at a very distinctive moment in recent American history, around 2014 and 2015, sort of the early, in some ways, I think the kind of early high watermark before 2020 of the Black Lives Matter movement. And there were a lot of conversations on the left at those times about sort of the internationalism or lack thereof of different corners of the American left. And um, I was really struck. I remember reading the policy platform of that the Movement for Black Lives put out in 2015, by the sort of really insistence on placing their demands for for police accountability and for divest invest kinds of demands within the context of a kind of global history of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. And that made me think that you know the longer arc of Black internationalism, let's say, was really where my academic interests were intersecting with some of what I was thinking about and engaging with politically as well at the time. And so from there, I kind of developed the more specific research agenda related to what became this book. And I can talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, yes. And just for the audience to know, the eye roll was not at Sam. The eye rolls because I grew up in New York City. So there's no way I could do anything but roll my eyes at a Boston fan. Let's dive a little bit more into that before we talk about the book specifically. How does a Boston boy growing up and eventually going to Harvard specifically come to this topic of race and the intersection of American politics on an international stage? What inspired you? Was it specific courses or teachers or events? You mentioned Movement for Black Lives. It's usually an internal, external. You want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a long road, and it developed out of, as you say, a number of different influences. Um, Growing up, in the area around Boston, in a kind of middle class home. I had the benefit of having two parents who were both very interested in kind of writing and intellectual work. My mother was a high school English teacher, or she's now retired. Was a high school English teacher and a poet, and so they urged me to take very good care with language. And they were also, I think, very interested in sort of opening my eyes and my brother's eyes to some of the problems of society and the world. And I think, like a lot of people of my generation, two events that really influenced my sort of developing political consciousness were, on the one hand, the Iraq War, and on the other hand, Hurricane Katrina, which took place in a very different part of the country than I was living in, and affected very different communities than the community that I came from. But I think those events happening when I was 14, 15, 16 years old, um, kind of the intersection of those two events, which revealed so clearly both the kind of growing imperial role of the United States on the world stage, and also the ways in which resources were systematically denied to Black communities in New Orleans, and then that was highlighted so vividly um, with the response to Hurricane Katrina, but also in places much closer to home, within Boston, for instance, sort of started, I think, somewhat of a growing kind of political consciousness. And throughout college, I was sort of engaging with politics in various different ways. Initially kind of along fairly, conventional like liberal electoral politic lines. Realized that that world was maybe sort of not exactly where I wanted to pursue my interests, and was also becoming very, very interested in the study of history. Took a number of wonderful courses as an undergraduate from scholars like Samuel Roberts and Eric Foner at Columbia, which sort of put me down the path that I ended up going on in some ways. And that kind of brings me up into where I started the conversation, which was how I kind of came to formulate my ideas about what would become the dissertation and then the book.
So you just mentioned that the book was first a dissertation. You defended in, I guess, the spring of that turbulent 2020, right
Hmm.
on the backs of, the unauthorized killings, murders, some would say, of, of course, George Floyd, but always Ahmaud Arbery, and of course others. And then the book comes out in the spring of 2025. Right? That's a 5-year leap. We
Hmm.
have some graduate students here. Some are in the humanities, and many will be trying to turn their dissertation projects, when they're done with them, into some type of publication, whether it
Hmm.
be an article or a book. Let's stick with the book for a second. What was that process like? And now looking back on when you were writing it, probably from 2018, 2020, to the journey to actually publishing it in 2025, what type of hints, tips, things that went awry do you have for our graduate students, specifically our doctoral students?
Oh, great. What a generous question. Yeah, it has been thinking about when I defended my dissertation, which was in May of 2020, and then the book, which was actually supposed to initially the original scheduled publication date was Inauguration Day 2025, and then the press moved it a week. So a lot has changed in the world over that time, and a lot has not changed. But in terms of the writing process, I think one thing that helped me was during the process of writing my dissertation, developing a clear idea that I wanted the dissertation to become a book. And that's not going to be true in every field, and that's not going to be true for every person. But I think having a vision when you're in the process of working on your dissertation of what do I want this to become afterwards, right? Maybe I want it to become a book. Maybe I want it to become a series of articles. Maybe I want it to inform, inform my work in practice in some specific way. But having that idea and then discussing that with your advisors, that really helped me even before defending the dissertation, getting an understanding of not only, okay, I need to write this dissertation to please these 4 or 5 people on my committee and have their acknowledgement that, I'm a capable scholar, but already be thinking about the next step at that point, and having kind of the endorsement of my committee to do that. That was really important to me. The road from dissertation to book itself was a little bit bumpy at times. And the first thing that in terms of practical steps that I sort of started doing after defending the dissertation was getting in touch with editors at some presses where I had basically presses that published books that I thought were really good in the fields of African American history and U.S. diplomatic history and U.S. intellectual history, and just starting some conversations about my work and what other books that they had published, and that sort of helped me form some relationships with a couple of different editors. And I quickly got a sense of, okay, a certain press isn't going to be that interested in this, another press really is, and that helped me kind of align what I wanted the project to be with an editor who I thought really understood that vision, with University of Chicago Press. And then, because life intervenes, it wasn't like I could just fully just work on making the dissertation the book after that. I was on the job market and moving around and moving from position to position for a number of years before winding up at Loyola, which made the work on the book happen a bit in fits and starts. But I think it really helped to have already outlined a proposal and already had a sense of um, how I wanted the substance of the dissertation to morph into the substance of the book. And in terms of substantive changes, there were several different editions. I expanded the last couple of chapters relating to the Black Power movement over the course of turning the dissertation into a book. I took the structure of the dissertation chapter by chapter and divided those up for as many historians will find, dissertation chapters end up being expand they keep expanding and they maybe become too long, and so I had a lot of help with working with my editor to say, okay, this is not going to be 6 really giant chapters, so what is it going to be? It's going to end up being 10 much more manageably sized chapters. So there were organizational things as well as bits of content, bits of research that I either hadn't been able to fully do for the dissertation or simply hadn't been able to fully integrate into the text that I spent really the next couple of years working, again, not always as consistently as I would have liked because of the job market and teaching responsibilities and so on, but finding time to do that and having again having the partnership with that editor really made that possible.
No, thank you for that. And let's now get into the heart of the book. But I'd like to remind the audience, this is not meant to be you observed Sam and I talk type of event. In about 15 to 20 minutes, we will turn to audience Q&A. But if you want to get ahead of the line, feel free to put your questions at any point within the chat. The chat is open for you. If you have a question, if you're a doctoral student, or you have a question, if you're an audience member, feel free while we're talking to put your question in the chat. Of course, when we get to audience Q&A, if you want to unmute, you could do it that way as well. But we usually have a few questions right off the bat in the chat. And with that said, let's get into the sort of meat and potatoes, if you will. Again, the book is called The Internal Colony, Race and the American Politics of Global Decolonization. Summarize the main arguments of the book for the audience. What is an internal colony? Sort of maybe an oxymoron to some folks. Where did the concept come from? And how did the concept of an internal colony impact Black American conversations about decolonization, as well as the internal struggle for civil rights, right at the end of the civil rights movement, and as you alluded to, into the Black Power movement?
Absolutely, great. The central argument of the book is that global decolonization, by which I mean the end of European formal imperial control over many countries in especially Africa, but Asia as well, in the period surrounding and just after the Second World War, had a much deeper influence on American debates about racial and class inequality domestically than scholars have hitherto fully reckoned with. And I approached this argument through looking at, as the title of the book makes clear, and as your question alluded to, African Americans' growing engagements with the process of decolonization and their growing interest in rethinking the terms of American society and their understandings of American racial hierarchy in relation to global decolonization. And that is what the internal colony is really, as a concept, is really about. So I provide a kind of genealogy of this concept in the book. It is most commonly associated with, it's a kind of conceptual touchstone in some ways of the Black Power movement, as I mentioned before, but it has a longer history, dating back to the 1920s and 1930s, and I really identify the 1940s as a moment of transformation in relation to the concept. In some ways, the concept of the internal colony is part of an even longer history of thinking, in Black political thought, of thinking of African Americans as a nation within a nation. That's a phrase that is used by Martin Delany in the 19th century. It's used by W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, who, of course, were in many ways politically opposed in the early 20th century. But the particular formulation of internal colony, scholars have often traced this to the work of Harry Haywood, who was a very important Black communist organizer and intellectual, um, who developed the thesis of self-determination in the Black Belt, arguing that African Americans, like oppressed nationalities globally, should have political self-determination in and this is again in the late 1920s, the states in the American South where they constitute a numerical majority. Um, and this concept becomes part of the Communist Party's platform um, of their agenda in the 1920s and 1930s. And other African American scholars and activists, including others on the left, dispute Haywood's conceptualization of this. But they start engaging, and I talk in the book about Ralph Bunche quite a bit in this section, who was, in the 1930s, really a much more of a kind of Marxian radical thinker than he would later become in the 1940s as he became more and more integrated with the U.S. diplomatic policymaking apparatus. So he's kind of working through what he thinks about Haywood's idea and trying to formulate different ways of linking the question of colonization of European empires abroad and the circumstances of African Americans as as the phrase often went then, as a quote unquote oppressed nationality at home. And I really identify the 1940s as a moment when the concept of internal colonization transforms and becomes detached from the particular kind of ideological line of the Communist Party and thus open to a broader range of thinkers and activists across American life. And the reasons for this, I think, are twofold. Number one, World War II and the collapse of the international system that World War II represented was also a moment of openness in thinking about the possibilities for decolonization. It was clear to many within the United States, including many African Americans who had been advocating for anti-colonial causes for many years, that the British and French empires, in particular in Africa, would not be able to survive in the exact same way that they had after the war, because the war was so devastating to those nations' economies and societies. And so that raised a whole host of questions about, well, what would come next? What would be the process, through which decolonization would occur? And many African American thinkers were deeply involved in thinking through those questions. I write in particular about um, W.E.B. Du Bois, Rayford Logan, who was a Howard University historian and also a very influential figure in the NAACP's Foreign Affairs Department, as well as Ralph Bunche, and their kind of engagements with these questions of how decolonization would happen and what the role of African Americans who had supported anti-colonial causes would be in that. And at the same time, you have and so many of the ways that they thought about that were through these kinds of analogies, through these sorts of comparisons between the colonial world and the prospects for decolonization and the systems of racialized economic exploitation that they had experienced and that they had been studying and advocating around in the United States. And what I term the politics of colonial comparison becomes increasingly important in the 1940s for this cohort of Black thinkers and activists seeking really to transform the international system. And at the same time, because of the Great Migration, which has, by the 1940s been accelerating, and the conception of self-determination in the Black Belt increasingly for many African Americans who live in the North, for instance, or in industrial cities in the Midwest or increasingly the West, that conception of a linkage between colonization and the specific territory of the Black Belt in the South becomes insufficient. And so there becomes a broader attempt to think through, well, you know, what makes the experience of an African American living in Bronzeville in Chicago, for instance, parallel to a colonial subject, in India or Nigeria. And that's something that African American scholars like St. Clair Drake, who I read about quite a bit in the book, and who I think is a kind of understudied figure in some ways in the history of Black political thought, or in the history of American social sciences as well. He is really sort of interested in this question in the 1940s. And so that becomes I think, a key moment in the book, when this question of making these analogies between colonialism globally and American forms of racial inequality really start to expand and kind of push beyond their initial boundaries. And that, I think, sets the stage for uh, in some ways the greater uptake of this concept of the internal colony later on in the 1960s, which I talk about later in the book.
No, that is fascinating. I have about 1,000,001 questions, but I only have 10 minutes. I see the questions in the audience have already started coming through. Please continue them. We'll get to as many as we can as soon as we're done with the questions that I have for Sam. But because we only have a little bit of time, as a lawyer, principally what we do when we have a concept, we stretch it, we see how far it could go, and then we sort of depth it, we see how deep it can go. Let's stretch this a bit, and let's talk a bit of the contemporary, right? So we have this concept of the internal colony, and thank you so much for going into a detailed explanation of it. Who else could it apply to? I'm thinking now principally of our Native American First Nations and Native American reservations. Would the concept, as you wrote about it, also apply to them? Outside of the racial context, right? If we can think about what has been, often described as MAGA country or Trump country. Our Vice President J.D. Vance wrote about this in Hillbilly Elegy. Appalachia, Southern Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, often is talked about as an exploited place, a very poor white area, voted predominantly for our current president, Donald Trump, but has been exploited as much economically as many areas that are predominantly African American areas. Would it be trite to put this internal colony label on those areas, or is there something unique about the African American experience that has its own the internal colony label? What do you think?
It's a really great question, and I'll answer first as a kind of historian, right? I'm trying to trace in this book sort of how this conception develops and the various ways in which it's used and the various kind of political agendas to which it gets put. And so I'll start with the second side of your question, because it does intersect in some ways with the narrative I talk about in the book in a couple different ways. Um, by the 1960s, many of the African American thinkers and activists who are embracing this analysis of the internal colony in groups like the Black Panther Party, in groups like the Republic of New Africa, and so on, are doing so in often kind of in conflict with war on poverty policymakers who are also understanding the problems of poverty in the United States in relation to global decolonization. And they have very different views on kind of how those things should be solved and how those things should be addressed. But they're also bringing, ideas and practices from international development into kind of domestic policymaking. And then I promise this connects with your question, because one of the places that these policymakers are most focused on is indeed Appalachia. And they're attempting to bring programs of economic redevelopment, in a kind of territorial, there's passed in the early 1960s something called the Area Redevelopment Act that sort of sees poverty as territorialized and identifies Appalachia as kind of one of the regions most in need of the kinds of redevelopment programs that, for instance, had been animating President Truman's Point 4 program of international development aid abroad. And so, as you have the increasing development of this concept of internal colonization within the Black freedom movement, and especially the Black power movement, you have others in, you know, in other communities seeking to, thinking through, does this apply to us as well? And so you have actually, in the aftermath of the story that I mostly tell here, in the 1970s and onwards, a number of people applying the same rubric to the territory of Appalachia in particular, right? And responding in some ways to that longer history of sort of liberal state intervention by thinking, we also are sort of, an exploited territory within the broader nation state of the United States. Now, as you mentioned, right, the the specific component that I think defines the concept of the internal colony in Black political thought is the concept of racialized economic exploitation. And that, of course, would not be present in the same way, thinking about, predominantly white communities in Appalachia, though, of course, not solely. Your other question about indigenous peoples within the United States is a really important one as well. And here I think we have to think about the relationship between various different types and forms of colonialism, right? You have the concept of settler colonialism that has been, widely applied to the kind of continuing American project of dispossession and violence against indigenous peoples. And one thing that again I discuss in the book a little bit is with the development of a kind of colonial language for thinking through racialized economic exploitation among African Americans, you have American Indian thinkers and activists trying to think through what the relationship between these forms of coloniality really are. And so I discuss in the book the writings of Vine Deloria Jr., who is a leading figure in indigenous activism and indigenous political thought in the United States, who is very inspired by the uptake of concepts of self-determination and internal colonization within by figures like Stokely Carmichael and other leaders of the Black Power movement, but who at the same time often flattens in his writings the longer history of Black freedom struggles within the U.S. And so that is a moment, and other scholars have written, I think, really compellingly about efforts to engage in kind of solidaristic forms of struggle between the Black Power and Red Power movements, for instance, at that moment. But it's a moment of, attempting to make connections, but also a moment when you have misunderstandings and miscommunications across these communities as well. And so I think, that's a history that I try to get into a little bit in the book. And it's, so I don't necessarily have a brief on the question of, this is exactly how it should be used and how it should be applied to. I think I try to think more about, how it has been used, what possibilities that opens up, and how those possibilities were also foreclosed.
No, thank you for that. That's actually a pretty good answer. And I swear to the audience, this is my last question. And then as soon as we're done with this one, we'll go to your questions. I see a few really good ones in the chat. And of course, we'll invite the audience to unmute and engage with you as I have as well. So my last question, it's probably an unfair question to a historian, but I think it does need to be asked. Because you mentioned the concept of settler colonialism. And, many people probably saw this and said, oh, the word colony is in there. What are they going to be talking about? As colonialism and colony has sort of become somewhat of a buzzword today. I appreciate the work of this book because it really is an in-depth historical analysis. But as a critical race theorist myself, I think, studying history is only as good as it can pragmatically help us going forward in the future. So I guess the question here is in two parts. Historically, did the discourse on what colonialism mean help us actually fight or encourage anti-colonialism, fight colonialism, encourage anti-colonialism? Did this discourse that African-American intellectuals have about decolonization, primarily in Africa, primarily in West Africa, actually inform US policy, or was it just left into discourse? And what could that discourse tell us today? as we are arguing over, the term settler colonialism, the term colonialism, and whether one nation or another nation's actions could have them deserving of the word colonialism. Is there anything about our past discourse, our past debates, that could sort of inform our discourse today to better understand the concept rather than why one nation should be labeled that or another?
Wonderful question. So I'll take the first part first. I think the adoption and various different programs that sort of were undertaken underneath the sign of the kind of internal colony thesis did have a clear impact. Not necessarily directly on governmental policy, but certainly on activism, on social movements as well, and certainly was brought to the attention of policymakers who thought that it was a significant development in American history. And so one way in which this had a clear effect was the rising consciousness. Again, this is sort of in particular, I trace this in particular in the 1960s, the rising consciousness among African American activists and thinkers of a kind of global majority of which they were in fact a part, rather than a kind of national minority of which they were considered by state policymakers, right? And so this is a really key insight of Malcolm X, for instance, in some of his speeches. And another kind of key effect, I think, of the adoption of this language of internal colonization is a greater focus on the structural and cultural dimensions of American racial inequality in the aftermath of the achievements of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. And so this becomes something that becomes sharply into focus with the post 1965 developments in the Black Power movement that is often articulated through these analogies with the colonial world. I think one major scholarly commitment that I really have is to see social movements and the Black freedom movement in particular as a source of theorizing, right? A source of conceptual innovation. And one concept that people are very familiar with today is the concept of institutional racism, which was really kind of formulated by by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton in their work Black Power. They were not the only ones to kind of think about racism in this way, but they really kind of coined that term in a meaningful way. And one thing that people kind of forget as institutional racism has become much more widely understood is that they actually say in the book Black Power, institutional racism has another name, colonialism. And so I think it's important to kind of see how these international modes of comparison contribute to some of the conceptual innovations that we would identify with that, really productive period of thinking and activism. Your question about how it affects us today, or what to do with the fact that there are all of these debates about colonial or colonialism as a kind of buzzword today. I think one thing that this history that I try to trace in this book shows is that people in America have been debating these questions for a long time. And so one, I think, really dangerous and wrong argument that's often been made, especially since especially since October 7th and the protest movements surrounding Israel's genocidal violence in Gaza. One argument that's often made by people opposing that protest movement is, well, it's just this new academic invention that people are talking about settler colonialism today, right? And these, these college students are just getting their heads filled with all these crazy new ideas that no one ever has really considered before. And so, I don't write specifically in this book about Israel Palestine, and I don't really write that much about the concept of settler colonialism. But one thing that my book shows is that the definition of colonialism in various forms has been a major topic in American political debate dating back at least 80 years. And in fact, longer than that, I think. But that's the focus of my book. So that at least should give us some arguments against the notion of, well, what's this crazy new thing that everyone's talking about now? I think more generally, or maybe in addition to that point about the oldness of some of these conversations, I think one thing that I hope the book can kind of bring into the present is the importance of a political vocabulary that identifies domestic problems in relation to global ones. And this is something that's really central to the Black internationalist tradition, right? Seeing parallels and connections between the conduct of states on a global scale and their treatment of racialized and minoritized populations at home. And that's something that I think remains valuable regardless of whether the specific concept of internal colonization is used. And so I think that is another thing I hope that people who read this book will think about going forward in the present.